Hello, thank you so much for joining me. Today we are starting a series on Erik Satie's first Gymnopédie. It's an infamous, beautiful piece. I'm sure you're familiar with it. And today we're going to be talking about things that we should always keep an eye out for when we're starting a new piece. And then we're going to take a look at some specific things that can be a bit tricky in this piece, and I will give you some exercises that can help you jumpstart your progress. So let's dive right in. First things first, we always want to check our time signature and our key signature. So this piece is in 3/4 time. Of course, that means we have 3 beats per measure, and we're counting our quarter notes as 1 beat. That's what our time signature means. If we look at the very beginning of the piece, we have 2 sharps, which means we have an F sharp and a C sharp. So whenever we're practicing this, we want to be remembering that we have these 2 sharps. Otherwise, we're going to run into some problems and have some things that aren't sounding quite right. Our time signature and our key signature are the first 2 things that we always want to look at when we're starting a piece. And then we should also take a look at our tempo marking. Here, forgive my pronunciation, please, our tempo is in French, and it says lent et douloureux. And what that means is slowly and painfully. So that already gives us an idea of the type of sound world that we're going to be creating here. And then once we've covered those basics, let's start taking a look at the notes themselves. So if we look very carefully, we see that we have a bass line that's always dotted half notes. So what's going to be happening throughout the piece is, I'm sure you're familiar with this opening, we have the bass note, and then comes a chord right after. 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. So we have, in the beginning, it's 2 different bass notes. We go from a G to a D, and those alternate for quite a while. And we have 2 different chords that we're also alternating between. We have this one here and this one. So depending on how we choose to look at these chords, we can describe them in a few different ways. But we'll come back to that later. Right now we just want to have a feel for where we're heading in our music. And we see that if you scan through your music, you're going to see this pattern a lot. It will change at some point, but it's already good to have this as an idea because that's really the basis of this piece. It's kind of a canvas that we're painting the melody over. So the left hand will be doing all of that, playing the bass note and the chords that are alternating. And then the right hand has mostly quarter notes. We have this flowing, beautiful melody that just floats gracefully above this tapestry that we have underneath in the left hand. In a few places, the right hand will have to help out with the chords, or you have the option of the right hand helping out in a few places. But again, that's something that we'll come back to in a little bit. And the other thing that I really like to look at when starting a new piece is to take a look at the structure of the piece or the form of the piece. And here we have our first theme that is quite long, but the piece is really kind of a repetition. We have the first how many measures? The first roughly 30 measures are repeated verbatim. We have exactly the same thing later. And then it's just the very last phrase of the first section and the very last phrase of the second section that are going to be different. So that's always nice to know in advance when we're starting a piece and it looks like, oh, we have so much to learn. There's so much to do. This is going to be so difficult. When we realize that really it's more or less half the amount of work as it looks like on the page, that's always a nice thing to notice from the very beginning. And then I promised you some exercises. So the first exercise is maybe not quite what you were hoping for, but my tip here to begin with is to practice the scales that go along with this piece. So how do we know which key we're in? We have 2 sharps, and we always have 2 options for our keys, right? We have a major and a minor for every key signature, for every number of sharps or flats that we have. And so with 2 sharps, that means we either have D major or B minor. And although this piece isn't employing a super traditional usage of keys, we don't see the classical symbols that we would necessarily expect. And we have lots of jazz style chords extended harmonies. But in the end, I think we're still more in the realm of D major than B minor. Particularly because in the bass line, I don't think the first B that we have is in measure 15, 16, 17, 18. And in contrast to that, we have many Ds. And our final chord of the piece is actually D minor, which again comes back to what I say is not a super traditional usage of harmony, that we have a piece that starts in D major and ends in D minor without any sort of proper or official key change. But that is kind of the sound world that we're living in this piece. So all of that is to say, I would recommend practicing your D major scale every time you sit down to practice this piece, just so that you sit down and you're thinking, okay, F sharp, C sharp. And really having that very present. You can play 2 octaves, you can play 4 octaves, you can play just 1 octave, you can play hands separately, hands together. That doesn't matter, but do something to get yourself acclimated to playing in this key. Then the next preparatory exercise that I would recommend is, of course, we're going to have lots of jumping, and the left hand does have a lot to do in this piece. But for starters, I would just recommend playing the very first chord that we see and alternating with the second one. And getting used to this back and forth motion. You can speed it up. Until you get really comfortable with these changes. And then when that is comfortable, then you can start to bring in these big jumps. But before that, I really want you to get used to finding where you're playing that chord and with which finger. So I would recommend playing 1, 3, 5 or 5, 3, 1, 5 on B, 3 on D, 1 on F sharp. And then the same fingering for the following chord. So the thumb stays on our F sharp, 3 and 5 slide down, and then they're going back and forth. And again, once that becomes comfortable, you can start to practice the jumps. For starters, you don't need to keep this in the rhythm. You can just practice it kind of evenly from one to the other, if you like. It's also good because 3/4 time can be a bit tricky, and it can be a bit tricky to stay in this swing of 3/4 time that we always need here. So as soon as possible, it's good if you switch over to the proper rhythm. So 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. And just get really comfortable with this, because the right hand's going to have to move really freely above it, and you're not going to have time to be thinking about this anymore. That I am immediately practicing this with pedal, because when you're practicing the chords back and forth just by themselves, that's not necessarily an important step. But for when we have this back and forth, this swinging, we're going to lose the bass note if we don't use the pedal. 1, 2. You can practice it that way. It also ensures that you're playing really cleanly and that you're not cheating in any way. It's always good to practice without pedal when we can, just to hold ourselves accountable. But pedal is going to be really essential for this piece. So this is actually a time when I would encourage you to use it sooner rather than later. And so what we want to do is we pedal with the G at the very beginning, and then we change on the D. Change with the G, change with the D. I have a whole video on pedaling and how to use the pedal. So this type of syncopated pedaling is awkward or uncomfortable for you, you can check that out. And there are also some exercises there that you can use to practice just different pedaling techniques, just in case you need it. But for now, know that you want to start using pedal as soon as possible while you're practicing this pattern. When we're starting new pieces, I also always advocate for practicing hands separately a lot. It's good to start practicing hands together as quickly as you're comfortable doing it, just because that's when we really start to develop this coordination. But in the beginning phases, practicing hands separately is really irreplaceable. You have the ability to really concentrate on what each hand needs to be doing. We also need to be worried about our foot in this piece. And so do have that in mind, but go ahead and start practicing the right hand separately also, and see how you go with that. Now, there's the next tricky spot, starts in measure 8. And what happens here is we have a long F sharp in the right hand, but then the left hand is supposed to keep playing the F sharp. And this can be did I say measure 8? Measure 9. What happens here is the right hand needs to be holding an F sharp, but then the left hand has chords that's also supposed to be playing the F sharp. And the chords are different, so we have to be changing the pedal. We can't just leave the pedal down and forget about it. We have to change it very reliably in every single measure. Otherwise, our sound is going to become too blurry. So this is also something that I want you to start practicing from the very beginning. And you don't necessarily need to practice the jumps to do this. And this is an instance where it's maybe good to practice without pedal, because then you know that you're really playing it like it's supposed to be played. So we play the F sharp with the right hand, and then the left hand takes it over on beat 2, but then the right hand is going to take it back over again without replaying the F sharp. And that's what we really want to listen for. We don't want to play one, we don't want to play 1, 2, 3, or we also don't want 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. We don't want the F sharp to be sounding anywhere except for on the second beat. This is very important. So it's good that you practice 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1. You let go just long enough for the left hand to play its chord. And then make sure that the right hand is always taking over the F sharp without replaying it and without losing it when we're changing the pedal. And the third spot that I think you can start working on separately is, we're going to start with the right hand in measure 22. And there's a spot where it's not necessary that you do this, but in measure 24 and 25 and 26, and then it's repeated in a few other places, but you can start with that section. The left hand can either play a chord that's a bit uncomfortable, or we can help it out with the right hand. And for me, I've tried it both ways, and I really think it's a bit better to take the top note of each chord with the right hand, just because then you're going to have more control over the chord that you have in the left hand. Otherwise, there's kind of the tendency to play the chords a bit louder than we want them to be, just because unless you have a very large hand, if you're blessed with a bigger hand than I am, then maybe it's not such a big deal. But for me, it's much more comfortable to control the chord to get the type of sound that I want when I help out with the right hand in that spot. So let's take a look. Let's start in measure 22. And then here, I'm going to slide over a little bit. I'm going to have to change my fingering because I want to take this E from the chord with my right hand thumb, and then this D as well. And here we have it again. And our Ds. I'll show you that one more time from measure 22. So those are 3 spots that I would really keep an eye out for from the very beginning. Now I have a few other recommendations of things that can in general be tricky in this piece. So I find it very hard that this piece starts in pianissimo. It's so much more difficult to play quietly than it is to play loudly. And we really want to be sure that we hear all 3 notes in the chord. It can be common that maybe one doesn't quite speak, it doesn't quite sing, we don't maybe hear all 3 notes. So be sure that when you're practicing, especially hands separately, because that's when we are able to have more awareness, that you're really hearing all 3 notes. This piece is already fairly meditative, but I think it's kind of a meditative exercise also, just to really have the awareness of, okay, I want to play quietly, but I still need to get to the bottom of the key and hear all of the notes in my chord. And I like to imagine to just really focus on my fingertips and to make sure that they're really settling into the keys, because sometimes when we're trying to play quietly, we tense up and we back away from the keys a little bit. But don't forget that we don't actually create a quieter sound by holding onto our arms. We create it by depressing the keys more slowly. We can also play with lots of tension. We can also press very hard. It's not about how hard we press. I'm pressing very hard with my fingers onto this key, but it's a quiet sound because the key is going down slowly. And when it goes down quickly, that's when we create our louder sound. So that is one thing to have an awareness of, and then also just to really focus on all of the fingertips are really secure on the key. And they're finding their place, they're finding the bottom of the key, playing all the way to the bottom. Gently, but really creating the sound that we want. And then the other thing that can be a bit tricky is when we have these chords moving around so much, especially when we're playing quietly, sometimes not all of the notes come at the same time, and we want to really be listening. All of them are reaching the bottom of the key at the same time, so that the sound is coming out at the same time. Another thing to listen for from the very beginning is that the melody is really singing out above everything else that we have going on. And one way that we can do this is just by practicing the right hand a lot and knowing exactly what we want to do there. But then when we put the hands together, sometimes when our brain tells the right hand to play loudly, the left hand receives the message also and plays louder as well. And so then we don't end up with the type of balance that we want in our sound. Something that I like to recommend that not all of my students adore is what I call ghosting. So that the left hand, we're depressing the keys, but just on the surface. And then we play the right hand on top of that, but actually play it. And so on. And then you can give that a try a few times, and then afterwards start playing the hands together normally again. And it's a magic trick. I don't know. I think something about the exaggeration of we actually activate what the left hand is doing without actually producing the sound, this exaggeration helps our brain understand, okay, that's the type of motion I need to create the balance of sounds that I want. This is maybe for the very, very beginning quite difficult. It's a really difficult exercise. It doesn't sound so hard. It's extremely difficult to actually manage. So if you give it a try and it's just too much, it's too difficult, maybe wait a week or two and then come back to it and see if you're able to have more success with it. And finally, the last difficulty with this piece that maybe doesn't sound so difficult on the surface is really staying in our meter. Playing in 3/4 time can be much more difficult than we expect. And we have a tendency to try to round things off to 4, that somehow a 4th beat sneaks into the measures. To deal with this, please count, but counting can also be distracting sometimes, and then it's not super productive. So if you notice that you're having trouble staying in 3/4 time and really sticking to having 3 beats per measure, slow it down and maybe play with metronome, or maybe record yourself, or maybe try to play along with the recording, and that will help you ensure that you're staying in our meter. I hope that all these tips help get you off on the right foot with this piece, and we'll be back next week with the next steps for learning Gymnopédie No. 1.